this on?
Yeah, it'll
Okay, well, come on. Actually, just a correction. It's not Malik's first book. It's his second book. His first book was actually an incredible meditation on race, which is not often remembered, but is a very important book. Thanks all for the invitation. And
Is it on?
it is on. Yes, it was on. Is it the battery, maybe?
Just a second. Here we go.
Keeps going off.
Yeah. Do you want to just take this?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Gautam, for the invitation and for hosting us so beautifully here. Thank you. And it's really inspiring to be at the center, and particularly to see how the project here is to bring a critical intellectual project together with practice-based interventions. It's very inspiring to see that from a place like South Africa. So what I'm going to talk about today is something that I don't work on in terms of my intellectual work, but I found myself caught up in very dramatically, and that is the new student protests that have been taking shape at South African universities and beyond. And what I want to try and think through today a little bit with you, mainly through a series of images that I've brought, is the relationship between the student protests at the university and the critique of urban space that they are implying, and see where we get to with that. So let me begin by saying that South Africa has the reputation of being statistically the protest capital of the world. So we have the highest number of protests per capita anywhere in the world. But these take a very interesting shape, because if you live in a middle class context in South Africa, you have very little sense that these protests are happening at all. In fact, the nature of protest follows very much the nature of the urban landscape of South African cities, which is this classic Fanonian colonial divide between the colonial town and the native township. The apartheid state took this classic colonial urban form and really entrenched it in the logic of the white town and the black township. And the black township provided residential space for black South Africans, not as permanent residents of the city, but always as temporary workers in the space of the city. The space for black South Africans, indigenous South Africans, under the apartheid regime was the rural homeland. And they were invited into the city through a strict system of pass laws and pass controls that regulated black entrance into the white city only for purposes of the provision of black labor for white capital. So, and the city really still takes this form of the predominantly white suburban city and the black township. This has changed somewhat in some cities in South Africa through a lot of immigrants from the continent who've come and occupied kind of central business district space. But largely, black South Africans still live in townships, and there is a growing, of course, you see all over the world, a growing migration from rural areas into the city. So you have an expanding black township, which is always on the edges of the peripheries of a city that is still largely controlled by white capital and white power. And so the protests that happen in black township spaces, which are usually referred to as service delivery protests, happen in township spaces, in black residential spaces. And the geography of protest is such that middle class and predominantly white folk who live in South Africa seldom hear about the protests other than on traffic reports. So the traffic reports, you'll hear this road is blocked by burning tires, so please take another route, right? This is the way information about service delivery protests circulates, not through kind of middle-class media space, which largely ignores this kind of protest. And protest has very much been located in poor black parts of the city. And so in the last few years, something very interesting has happened, and it's happened in the unlikely city of Cape Town, which is a new form of circulation of protest. And that has centered around what has come to be known as the poo protests, or the shit protests. And it's organized through a range of different social movements operating in Khayelitsha, which is a huge township on the very outskirts of Cape Town. And it's really a critique of the delivery of sewage infrastructure to the outskirts of the city. And the critique goes something like, poor black people on the peripheries of the city have no sewage systems, no functioning, no flushing toilets. What they are provided with by the city is basically a sort of slight upgrade from the bucket system, which is that you collect your sewage in a kind of plastic tub, and then that gets taken to a central sewage deposit in the city, and then it's collected from that place. And so the poo, what the social movements have been mobilizing around the poo protests is taking those plastic containers and taking them to parts of the city where they are not seen or not understood, or where they're never seen, right? So taking literally buckets of shit and putting them in white controlled downtown Cape Town, which of course, those of you who know Cape Town, is extraordinarily beautiful, very well maintained by a tourist infrastructure, largely for a European and North American market. So it's hugely inconvenient for the city of Cape Town when these buckets of poo show up in tourist places in downtown Cape Town. It's very important for politics against inequality that these buckets of poo show up, because what it does is it recirculates protests in very different kinds of ways than it's been circulating in the last few years. So the interesting thing about how the student movement started was at the University of Cape Town, a prominent, historically white colonial university on the slopes of Table Mountain, very much in the white part of the city. Black students, who remain a huge minority, even though the city is predominantly black, you wouldn't know so if you walked around downtown Cape Town. Black students on campus began to feel increasingly alienated by politics of white supremacy and the politics of middle-class Cape Town in the context of the university. And there was this really important event that happened on the 9th of March last year, when Umani Makwele, who's this man you see in the pink, I quite like the pink helmet, took a bucket of shit from township. You can see that's what the buckets look like, and threw the shit at a statue of Cecil John Rhodes, which occupies a very central place at the University of Cape Town. And the politics of Rhodes was that Cecil John Rhodes arrived in Cape Town, basically claimed the land as his own, and then donated a vast part of the backside of Table Mountain to the public of Cape Town, which was, of course, the white public of Cape Town. And on that land, the beautiful Kirstenbosch Botanical Gardens were built, highly celebrated tourist phenomenon, and the University of Cape Town. And so Rhodes has sort of been renowned, I mean, one of the most violent colonial figures, is renowned and celebrated in Cape Town as this sort of extraordinary philanthropist.
And very well known to every Indian student who has ever applied to a university abroad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So his statue, which sat right at the center of the University of Cape Town campus, was covered in shit by this student on the 9th of March last year, and created, excuse the pun, a shitstorm on campus, where many black students who'd been meeting separately in small groups to kind of register their discontent suddenly found a kind of vehicle for collective action and collective dissent. And so thus began a really interesting politics of occupation at university campuses. And what I think has been interesting is that a new circulation and occupation of university campuses by poor black students has also invoked this kind of new growing circulation of politics in the city. And there's been this sort of back and forth between black people's position in the city and black people's space on campus. And there's been a kind of tracking back and forth and an argument back and forth in the politics of that protest. So this is a building that's the central administration of the University of Cape Town. And it was occupied by the black student movement at Cape Town shortly after the statue was critiqued. And this is the hashtag that became famous, was Rhodes Must Fall. And the upstairs space of the boardroom was occupied. This is actually a video. Can you play the video? It will give you a sense of what that occupation looked like. If not, it's okay. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
We will get it out in the break.
Okay. So this was the room in the occupied administration building, which became known as Azania House. Azania was the term for a future free South Africa that was used during the anti-apartheid movement. So black students are now reclaiming the word Azania to critique the fact that South Africa has not exited apartheid effectively enough after the ANC presidency. So the occupation of the administration building took place, and there was an extraordinary series of events and new curricula that were devised in the context of that space, that occupied space. But also the space of campus really became invented as a kind of exploded classroom for the student movement. So here you see two members of the student movement who set up chairs. This was an action that many black students engaged with. Set up chairs and invited the students to come and sit and talk to them about the politics of the movement on campus. So this was sort of education, public pedagogy campaign on campus. And here, eventually the statue of Rhodes was removed, and you see the Table Mountain behind, and really got a huge amount of international coverage, I'm sure you saw here as well. So the occupation and recirculation became the kind of method of the new student movement. There was a very clear injunction from the student movement to disrupt campus space and to unsettle the kind of settled racial and class dimensions of the campus itself. And so I think what became clear was that as they developed the idea of decolonization, or the politics of decolonization, as the movement came to be renowned for, what decolonization meant was, and how it was enacted, was largely through action on space, kind of very profound critique of the way in which not only the space of the university was organized, but the relationship between the university and the urban space, and referencing the university as a critical exemplar of this classic division between town and township, between colonial city and native town. So it was a critique of space. It was also a critique of the way in which knowledge, politics, and power circulated. And it insisted, the student movement, on a new politics of proximity that I think the throwing of the shit onto the statue really demonstrates quite clearly. So the student movement took a little while to spread to other campuses and other universities. But something critical happened in the build-up to October last year. And that was the recognition that black students were not the only blacks on campus. That in fact, all of the service labor on campus is black, remains black. And the student movement was drawing very much from a reading of Fanon, and Fanon's reading of decolonization. One of his clearest expressions of decolonization is to put the last first and the first last. And so students were using this as a way to think through how does one elevate the status of and recognize the presence of black service staff, most of whom had been outsourced. That term is familiar here, right?
Slightly different directionality.
Okay. So there was at Wits University in Johannesburg, where I work, a really important action around the ending of outsourcing at Wits as a way to roll back some of the further dismissal or exclusion of black members of campus from the campus space. So this was from a big protest on October 6th around an end to outsourcing on campus. And what was interesting about this movement was that it was really one of the first times when the campus protests moved outside of the space of the university onto the streets of Braamfontein. So you see here, this is Johannesburg, and the student worker and Progressive Faculty Alliance that shaped this protest really it deliberately took the protest outside of the university, and we're thinking about the relationship between the university and the city in a new way. Well, a week later, on October 14th, was the beginning of what has now become known as the Fees Must Fall movement. And this was a direct reference to the fact that every year, increasingly, government is giving less and less money to public universities, and so universities are having to increase both private sector funding to universities as well as student fees in order to make up the difference between in this withdrawal of public money to the universities. So last year there was announced a 10.5% increase in student fees, which was way above inflation, and increasingly it marked over many years the privatization, slow privatization of public institutions. So initially the Fees Must Fall campaign was against this incremental increase in university fees, which for poor black students was meaning that ultimately, even though you qualified through merit, through very problematic secondary education, you wouldn't be able to get access to tertiary education. So the protest started on campus, and you see images of kind of blockading, of closing down access to campus by students. And this is also a video, I'm sorry you can't see it, but the University Vice Chancellor Adam Habib is quick to say, oh no, this is a small protest, this is a fringe movement, this is a handful of radical students and radical academics who can be dismissed, this is not a major movement. And this was the image that really kind of put pay to that argument that university managers were making. And here you see the occupation of the central administration building at Wits University. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of students who came to occupy the administration building, and renamed a lot of the sort of recirculation is about taking over buildings and renaming them. So Solomon House was the name given after a very famous anti-apartheid activist. And so the Fees Must Fall movement really became a national movement at this moment. So this image is really important because this is one of the first marches that happened outside of the university by the student movement. And increasingly the student movement has taken to the streets of whatever city the university is in, and really made a claim on urban space, and refused to read the campus as a space that is separate from the city. And this has really unsettled some long-standing assumptions about what a university is, what the purpose of knowledge is for, and how students should behave, who students are in relation to an urban polity. But critically here as well, there is a rule in South Africa, a law, that if you have a gathering in public of more than 14 people, you have to seek, some people say permission, some people say acknowledgement from the Metropolitan Police. And students here began taking to the streets without the protocol of having gone through Metropolitan Police. And what was really interesting is that, in part because these were students, there was a kind of permissiveness that was granted to them in the early days of the protests, but it was a permissiveness that quickly got taken up by the social movements, and there's a kind of relationship now between the student protests and other forms of protest that is really pushing the limits of what protests can be in the urban context. This happened a little while later. You see, this is Parliament in Cape Town, and this is a moment when students from a range of institutions across Cape Town pushed down the gates of Parliament to demand that the Ministry of Higher Education and Training came to consult with them. There was massive police response to this this protest, and this is something that the South African state does not want you to see. You see here the charge sheet given to a number of students who were involved in that protest, and you can see here the charge of high treason. Right? So this quickly got withdrawn because there was so much hostility towards this charge, but you can see the kind of threat that students are making, not only on the kind of politics of circulation, the politics of urban protest, but also the kind of pushing the limits of the authority of the state through this claim on space and on the circulation of protest. This is a protest in Johannesburg that left Wits University, and here you see, really interestingly, a group of leaders of various social movements from across the country that were at a social movement training program and came to Wits to march with students. So you see again these kinds of this relationship being built between student activists and activists who would have been involved in service delivery protests across the city, starting to build connections with each other. And they took the march again. This is the famous Nelson Mandela Bridge. They took to the streets of Joburg again without permission. And you can see the kind of scale of the protest. There was about another double this that joined them as they marched to Luthuli House, which is the headquarters of the African National Congress downtown Johannesburg. So there was this kind of triad of big marches in the city to these major public spaces, national public spaces. The first was Parliament in Cape Town, the second was Luthuli House, the headquarters of the African National Congress in downtown Johannesburg, and the third was to the Union Buildings, which is where government sits in Pretoria. And so there was this enormously powerful march by thousands of students from across the north on the Union buildings in Pretoria to explicitly challenge the African National Congress, right, the Liberation Party in government, about the role of universities and access to education. And this is an important image because at the Union buildings there were a number of students, particularly from the kind of peripheral campuses in township spaces. So they're often the campuses that the working class universities have campuses which are in township spaces. And a lot of those students came to the Union buildings from township spaces who would have been involved in forms of urban protest delivery in township spaces, and brought the politics of that protest to the student movement and to the space of the Union buildings. So there was, and it was extremely controversial. A lot of the middle class kids got very anxious right at this moment because it was their first confrontation with a working class protest. And they were part of the movement and yet had to deal with, in fact, a lot of the things that were burned was, were these, the plastic toilets that are brought to events that have chemicals in them. So these toilets were dragged to the front of the barricades where the riot police were and were burnt right at the foot of the Union buildings. And fire is an extremely important sign in South African kind of subaltern politics. It's a marker, it's a very important marker of a kind of urban discontent and urban protest. And so directly after that protest, this is an image that taken 2 o'clock in the morning when a Wits student, right, historically white middle class university, lit a fire at Wits University at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it freaked everybody out, right? Completely freaked everybody out. But what students were doing was directly invoking the politics of township protest at a previously white university. Right? So there was this conversation, if you like, happening between the space of campus and the space of the township in a completely new way that had not happened before. This is inside the fire. Okay, a couple more images and then I'll end. This is that was at the very end of last year. There were major victories won, but not enough. The ANC decided on a 0% increase for fees last year, but of course it doesn't roll back fees. It doesn't make for free public education. It simply means that this year there's no increase in public education fees. And also there was a major victory won to insource service workers on campus, which I think was an incredible victory. And that happened through the radicalization of students through this encounter with working class protest. And so students went home, they came back early this year. This is an image from a couple of weeks ago where students were attempting to reoccupy Solomon House at Wits University to shut down the registration process on campus. It was met with violent force. The university called in private, what can only really be called as riot police, onto campus and forcibly evicted students from Solomon House. Here you see, this is a group of some of our radical students who have carrying mattresses, trying to reoccupy the building, and they're met by this private paramilitary force. And when we've been doing some research on the nature of these private security companies, many of them are owned and managed by previous white members of the apartheid security forces who've reinvented themselves as private entrepreneurs in the security industry. So this is the situation we're at the moment, where student protest again has been sort of not only forced back into campus, but students have been there's an attempt to force students out of spaces where they could make trouble even on campus. So there's a kind of recirculation of capital and security and private security onto campus in ways that wasn't even there during the darkest days of apartheid. This never happened on university campuses. Here's an example of the kind of, this is what I have to walk through to get to my office now. And just to show you that there's an attempt by progressive academics and students to try and reclaim the narrative of the student movement and to move beyond repression by engaging again urban space to try and do some work towards repopularizing the movement and reclaiming the space. So this is a graffiti that went up a few days ago. This Asina Mali means we have no money, fees must fall. And the last one, which has just been finished by an amazing graffiti artist in Johannesburg. Asina Mali, we have no money, and then this new politics which is emerging around the demilitarization of campus space. So what I hope I've tried to do is to show this relationship between the university and urban space, and to kind of show how there's a new kind of vacillation in terms of urban protest between campus and township space.
Thank
I didn't take too long.
No. While we put up Maliq's PowerPoint, I just want you to hold on to a thought that we'll come back to in the last session, which is the idea of what you said about occupation and circulation as method. And I think it strikes very much at a question not just on how the methods of actually occupying and living and circulating in the city, of practicing politics, mirror sort of our ways of studying the city as methods, and why these practices are not also part of the intellectual production on the city, and to think about them, I think, in many ways. I also think it's incredibly striking how nuanced your description of the protests were, both in terms of how registers of violence were inside the movement causing discomfort to each other on class lines, on signifiers being different. And I think that's an insight that you can only get to see when you look very closely, but also about how, in some way here, all the actors involved are evoking certain forms of violence, with different notions of legitimacy, with different ethical locations, with different strategic locations. But it's partly in a way in which these registers and symbols and cycles of violence constantly circulate and become, in a way, the way we talk to each other. And I think that's a very important question when, in a public university, under a democratic constitution, when the registers become about occupation and mattresses and riot police and guards, and where one goes in politics over there. Maliq. Do you have the clicker?
The clicker. Well, Gautam, I sure do appreciate your bringing me down here. Because, as they say, if you haven't been here at this place and you're in the urban business, you really haven't been anywhere. So. At all. So I do appreciate finally getting it over with. Thank you. Since you basically said I'm not going to present any empirical work. You asked for some things of what's on my mind, some things I'm trying to begin to do work on in Jakarta in terms of fast and slow, of disjunct times, and what those times have to do with each other. So within the nervous system of Jakarta at the moment, and I'm going to go fast rather than slow given the time. So within the nervous system of Jakarta at the moment, the neurons are crossing the synapses like at super speed, in this kind of a rush, really a rush to build everything everywhere, and trying to understand a little bit about what that rush is. And it's in part to remake this, but there's something else besides just the remaking this. And in some ways, of course, speed promises the possibility of extending the metropolis across a broader physical terrain, so high-speed trains, flyovers, optics, logistics, just-in-time everything. It spaces out the heterogeneities of the city, its inequities, in such a way that the infrastructures that make speed possible become increasingly the content of the city itself. And such are the fantasies of total access. Anytime, anywhere, and no mobility does not have to worry about interruption, where physical and media infrastructures permit unimpeded journeys suited for self-aggrandizement and predictable sociality. You don't have to be interrupted, you don't have to be contaminated, you don't have to be slowed down, you don't have to be mediated. It's all about the fantasy of self-aggrandizement. And so clearly most everything does circulate, more extensive and rapidly. While at the same time the available platforms on which to make use of that circulation, to plan, to settle, and to cultivate over time also diminish. So in some ways speed becomes the method of self-aggrandizement, but the ability to plan and to settle also is diminished in face of this kind of enhanced speed and circulation. And so self-aggrandizement gets formatted, gets organized in much more parochial and narrow terms, even though speed itself promises the possibility of complete access to anything and anywhere. So there's a kind of contradiction at the heart of this kind of method of the rush to build. But yet, the rush is also informed by the attempt to deal with the appreciation that the present is volatile. The present is uncertain. So the rush to outpace the volatility of the present. So escalating land prices, labor shortages, changing policy frameworks, cost overruns, widening disparities in interest rates incurred by borrowing in different currencies. The rush to build tries to outpace a creeping diversification of options in the housing market. It rushes to consolidate land replete with various histories, ownership structures, entitlements, and functions. It rushes to negotiate with different kinds of authorities who drive their power from the mobilization of different interests and constituencies that often live side by side but have very, very different kinds of logics for consolidating their authority. It rushes to stay under the threshold of potential antagonisms that might slow down progress of projects producing the prospect of substantial financial loss. It rushes to establish particular facts on the ground, even if deemed later illegal or impractical, at least are hard to change or to be substantially altered. So all of this rush to build in aggregate creates the very conditions that developers seek to outpace. That is, you're attempting to rush in order to address all of the uncertainty in all of these conditions that you face, but in aggregate, the sum total of this rush produces the very uncertainty which the rush attempts to address. So in some sense, it's constantly flipping over on itself in the tortoise and the hare sort of story. So you're dealing in a city like Jakarta with variegated and rapidly shifting land use patterns, speeded up circulation of residents across different housing locations, the formation of growth boundaries in the form of massive industrial land estates at the periphery, a youth demographic that floods the market with new workers every year, an accelerated rollout of all kinds of rail systems bypasses, the uncertain morphological and ecological implications of massive concentrations of new developments in particular parts of cities. All of these impact upon each other. All of these have a kind of relationship with each other, which end up amplifying the sense of urgency to use infrastructure as the method, as the means in which to mark a kind of stabilization. That is, in some ways, that those who act, that those who have to decide, that those who have to do something, have to take all of these kinds of factors into consideration. And in some sense, trying to take them into consideration compel the use of infrastructure as a method in order to stabilize some kind of position in relationship to all these increasing variables. So in some sense, it's an infrastructure that is detached from an appreciation of how it itself intensifies the volatility it attempts to stabilize. So infrastructure as method used in these kinds of circumstances in the rush to stabilize is in a large part detached from the appreciation of the way in which it contributes to the volatility that it itself tries to seek to stabilize. So in some sense, the use of infrastructure then becomes, in a way, not just a sense of speculation, but it becomes also a means of instigating a kind of future which it can't really anticipate. That is, in some sense, when you talk to developers, when you talk to planners, when you talk to government officials, there is some kind of sense that wanting to be part of something which they themselves can't anticipate what it's going to be. So you use the rush to build as a way to situate yourself in a process which you don't really know where you're going to land. You know that you're going to land someplace, but you know that in some ways you want to.
Keep going. No, don't stop now.
So it is in some sense a kind of process beyond speculation. It is in some sense a kind of magical way, as if the kind of rush to build will bring about a kind of future which no one knows for sure, but since you have built something and you're there, you can participate in it in some kind of way. This is why a lot of times developers don't worry about whether or not something is profitable or not. It's a lot of times why they don't worry whether or not a project works now or not. The present is not something that's important. You don't assess this now in the present. You assess it now in a future which you don't really have a lot of ideas about, but you know that you're contributing toward and that you're positioned in some way that something will happen. So the key becomes how you configure a position in which you can possibly relate to that. So if you build a commercial space and it stands empty, it doesn't matter for the moment. It's there, and in the future that you have a kind of asset and a kind of concrete position which you can use to relate to something that you don't really know what it is now, but you have a kind of positionality. It is a kind of stance. It is a concrete kind of way of saying, this is my position.
And in a perfect world right now, this image will come back.
Yeah, but I don't know what comes next.
Like the developer.
Yeah, I don't know what the future is here. I mean,
but if we keep going, then we can construct some version of it until the present catches up. The future is Microsoft starting normally.
What was the previous image of? Like just any people, what was it? Just like
Skyscrapers and the poles in the street.
It was you mean the long concrete bars?
Yeah.
And with the skyscraper up front. It's like, you can imagine it as the first step of creating the bypass on that road.
Everything that I just keep thinking that we could be talking about that.
Okay, and I think that's part of that logic. Sorry about this.
I mean, even if you look at the content of the financing of many of these projects, the composition of the financing is such that it can go either way. That is, you're hedging against many different kinds of possible futures. If it works now, fine. If it doesn't work, it's also fine, because you've hedged the financing in such a way that it doesn't matter. You've already, yeah, okay. So the sense I'm trying to see here, to get at here, is that it's that the use of building is a kind of instigation. It's an instigation that it encompasses and goes beyond speculation. For it is not only a financial operation to hedge a lot of probable futures for how a specific infrastructure will operate and the value it will have, but this instigation also aims to posit infrastructure as detached from any reason, within a scenario that can't be fully calculated now, and which imbues it with an adaptability to futures where no matter what happens, there's the possibility of recouping something which can't be specified now. That is, in some sense, this is the aim. And the rush to build then becomes to be able to assemble it in such a way that it can address this kind of possible future. On the other hand, there are speed traps. So there's a way in which there's processes in which things can slow down. So there's speed, and then there's a way in which you attempt to try to slow things down. To think about how value is created through a multiplicity of different logics, denominations, and statuses. Not all things need to have the same legal or economic state of existence. And here, I'll just give you an example. Throughout Jakarta, you have the appearance of large-scale affordable housing developments in the midst of popular neighborhoods. And between now and 2010, 500,000 units of so-called affordable housing will be built like this, that will appear in the midst of popular neighborhoods, of which Jakarta primarily was a city of. Now, these are 16 square meter to 32 square meter flats in developments which have many of them. I mean, 18,000 units at a crack. And what is interesting to me about this kind of process is that it goes through a kind of mirroring. These become kind of twins or anti-twins. The popular neighborhood and the new vertical towers. And what's the relationship? What kind of dynamic gets created through the contiguity of the existence of these two very different forms? And what we know so far is that in some ways they begin to impersonate each other. That is, the financial model which makes those vertical towers affordable assumes that they're going to be bought and occupied by either single individuals or small nuclear families. Well, the predominant mode of occupying residence in Jakarta is not one of a single resident or a small nuclear family. It just simply doesn't happen. So in order for these to be viably occupied, they will not be according to the imaginary of the resident that went into building them. So they have to impersonate from the popular neighborhood where people do not even live together usually as nuclear households. They live in all different kinds of configurations. Sometimes households, sometimes not, sometimes extended families, sometimes not. So in order for these vertical towers to be viably occupied, they will have to impersonate the mode of residence of the popular neighborhood. Now, how that ends up taking place is not so clear yet, because the people who own these units are mostly not the ones who are going to end up occupying, and the prefab structure that goes into the building of them is not within 5 years going to be that which actually exists as the kind of built space in which people live. So there'll be all kinds of subcontracting arrangements, and the future of this we don't really know, because how much can you play with the structural parameters of these vertical towers? At the same time, the popular neighborhoods begin to impersonate the kind of imaginary of the vertical tower. That is, they begin to rework their own built structures to make them look more like the individual flats of the vertical towers, even though the vertical towers are impersonating the flexible structure of the popular neighborhood in order. So you have this kind of mirroring image where things are going on all the time in relationship to each other. The impact of the popular upon the vertical, the impact of the vertical on the popular, no one sits still within the form in which it looks. So in some ways, what the question I have, or many of us in Jakarta have in terms of looking at this, is what will this do? Because when we talk about impersonation, when I impersonate you, I take a few of your gestures, all the details of you, and I take a few of them and I reflect them back, and you can sort of recognize yourself. But in order to impersonate you, I don't need to take every detail that you have. In this relationship of mutual impersonation, what makes things slow down is that you create a kind of process of expersonation. And by expersonation, I mean that in this relationship between the vertical and the popular, you flood the space with all kinds of unanticipated details. There are all kinds of things happening that you don't quite know exactly what to make of. And so the space becomes an excess of details, of which are very difficult to frame and very difficult to make policy around. How do you govern this? I mean, the Jakarta local government now has to come in and say, what do you do when you add 60,000 new residents? Do we make local authorities within the towers themselves? Do we connect it to the population? All of this is up for grab because there's such a surplus of unanticipated details, because the popular is also changing all the time in relationship to this. Changes in the built environment, changes in the use of space, changes in the kind of entrepreneurial culture, the ways in which the kinds of economic activities that people relied upon in order to get the money, in order to be able to occupy the vertical tower, now don't have the space to do. The popular becomes a possible venue for them to do it. So in some ways, this is a way of slowing things down. It becomes the kind of contrast to the rush to build. So how do you think then about a metropolitan area with these two different kinds of trajectories? One, a kind of rush to build, which builds beyond any kind of assessment of efficacy in the present, and a kind of process of slowing things down because you have an excess of details which you don't know quite what to make of. So we want to now begin to look at this.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Let me do one thing now because of time. Let me actually take 2 questions from the floor, and then I'll do one and we'll go back to 2 so it doesn't again break us up. So anyone want to jump in on the first 2? Yeah.
Thank you. My question is, I'll just jump in. The thing is, I've noticed that you've given a certain individuality to these developments, almost like as if it is an entity in itself, as if it assumes the different decisions of all the different parties at many levels, and then that identity is reflected in what you are assessing then. Within, say, a popular neighborhood or a high-rise. So in that sense, I wanted to ask, what do you think is then the role of such, say, a group or a neighborhood or a community, which then takes these decisions to come to terms with forces of globalization or modernity or whatever it is that they're chasing? So, because the entire discussion, like she correctly pointed out, is quite applicable to Bangalore or any other modern Indian city. So it's quite relevant, everything that you've mentioned. And this whole mirroring aspect is kind of an eye-opener, because it makes us look at these same things which we've been observing past few years in a new way. So what do you think is the role then of these, to basically these communities to come to terms with modernization, globalization, these forces which are kind of forcing us to speed things up and start this whole expersonation?
Let me take one more. I'll come back to you guys.
Yes. So I thought the thinking on speed was very interesting, and I want to emphasize that part. I'm not sure the opposite is slowing down in quite the way you described. So I'm quite interested in the way you put those two things together. So let me get to the speed part. So the idea, I guess it would be very interesting to hear you discuss the way you described infrastructure in terms of connectivity, in terms of investment without reason, as a way also to think about historically the types of infrastructure lots of cities have invested in. It could be rail stations, it could be water and sewage systems, some of the old style stuff, alongside some of the, what I would call the ones that are more endemic that we notice these days, things like very big flyovers or giant highway systems and so on. So except for a few country exceptions, most countries did not have, for instance, highway systems, but they had perhaps rail systems or rail stations and so on. So if you could maybe push your provocation on speed a little more by discussing what might be speedier forms that you're looking at now versus more mundane systems that perhaps existed but were equally perhaps fast in terms of a historical moment before. Because it's tempting to see highways or certain kinds of infrastructure now as manifestations of certain kinds of economic processes, but those perhaps always existed. So I want to hear a little bit more, because I think your insight on the speed without reason, or the infrastructural spaces without reason, is, I think, a very interesting one, and would be good to hear more about it.
Can you do a short response? The two of those.
I mean, I think part is that the use of infrastructure in a kind of modernist urban sensibility was a way in which to maximize the potentials of articulation amongst a sense of pre-existing things, pre-existing sources of value, pre-existing or things that could be easily anticipated, an area that was going to take off or to grow, or a way in which places of work and residence could be articulated to places of production, or places of, that there was a sense of infrastructure as a means of connecting a social and economic body of which there was some kind of image of. I think the difference in Jakarta is that there is a sense that sociality is something much more effervescent and excessive and unknown. And you use infrastructural projects almost as a way to conjure it into some kind of visibility that you can't see now. And it becomes then a kind of tool, a kind of method in which to make visible certain kinds of modalities of urban sociality and the possibilities of articulation, the possibilities of synergy, of which you don't have a kind of mode of making visible at the moment. There is that, And there is also the sense of particularly in Jakarta, where the forms of mediation are so thick that in order to go from one place to another, you have to go through a lot of different histories, a lot of different logics, and the way in which you try to bypass the accumulation of that into something else. But I think the two work together. One is a kind of circumvention of what exists, and the other is almost a use of infrastructure as a mode of conjuring into existence a kind of form of sociality that in some ways goes beyond throughout Asia you've had the proliferation of the all-in-one. That is, these kinds of modes of inhabiting the city where everything is there. Residence, hotel, school, you don't have to leave it in order to go to the airport. And so you have a city of enclaves. But I think that this is changing. This is changing in the sense of how you use infrastructure as a way to bring into existence a kind of form of synergistic relationships amongst things that you don't really have a kind of you don't have an image of its visibilization. And infrastructure becomes the kind of way into that, without having to go through all of the very mundane histories and the thickness of everyday lives that have characterized the city in the past.
But I just want to mark that I think that the other thing that's very striking in the way you speak about this process is the absence of any fixed agents or actors. Because the insistence in what you're saying is that the uncertainty of this logic is not just that of the popular neighborhood, but also that of the planner and the policymaker and the ones who can command and instigate infrastructure with greater capital, but with equivalently less control. Because we have a narrative of conjuring when it comes to the informal and the sporadic and the outside. But the truth is that the butter sheet plan, the notion of the highway and the flyover is as sporadic. And that's when you actually see the city as a set of actors where everyone is trying to foot their door into this speed and nail something down for a minute. Not in the modernist imagination of, if I build it, they will come. But if I put here, this will create this way and push that way. And it makes it makes the question of intention suspect, eternally suspect, in a way that's both empowering and disempowering at the same time. Because it also means cities can't be rewritten very easily. It means that the twinning is constant. I want to bring this question back to Kelly that sort of connects but takes us off into a slightly different direction, which is then to both of you also is, what do we do then with this object called the city that is then blurry and fast and slow and outside our grasp and in multiple time? It's invoked in the campus and the university, but partly what I'm thinking is, so I'm going to ask you two slightly connected questions. The first is, how do we imagine this object called the city? Does it still work? Is it a place? Is it a container? Is it a concept? Is it the ex-person? Is it a reflection? What does it do to our thinking? And the second question then is, to both of you, is that referent? So if the audience, if people hearing us look back and say, this sounds like Bangalore, the question is, would someone also say this sounds like New York, or it sounds like London? I want to make that provocation obvious, because one of the things we're saying to each other is that Bangalore, Jakarta, Johannesburg speak to each other in a way that other cities don't. And Kelly, you've been part of something called the Johannesburg Workshop on Theory and Criticism as a co-convener of this for 8 years. The idea that even critical theory, the idea of philosophical critical theory, placeless, has to be thought from place. That knowledge must be generated in place. And Malik, a lot of your work has actually moved between the South and the North in a way that those boundaries are not so certain. You've written about blackness in Chicago, the city of your birth and the city of much of your life. And if you think about questions of Black death in contemporary America today, questions of Black Lives Matter, questions of Detroit and Chicago, are we, by insisting on this difference between the North and the South, acknowledging actually different echoes? or are we setting up slightly false differentials? So there are twin questions to both of you. One is this question of how do we, at this moment of speed and transition and reference and movement, think about an object called the city, an object that we would teach here? And what is your experience with JWTC and with the idea of blackness and black violence in Chicago done to unsettle your ideas of southern and northern cities? So, Kelly, do you want to take a first shot?
Those are quite some questions to hold together. But let me make a stab. I think what I lift off from is a historical moment in the 1940s in South Africa, where for the first time in the history of the country, a census, 1947 I think it was, census, showed that there was a black majority in South African cities. And this produced such incredible anxiety amongst the white voting populace, urban populace, that it basically heralded the voting in of the apartheid state. So there's the presence of Africans moving from rural agricultural space into the city prompted a level of white anxiety in the colonial project that produces the apartheid relation. And I think what I and certainly many others of my generation are invested in is how do we push substantively such that one can undo the apartheid relation. That's our project. That's our fundamental political and intellectual project, is how to undo the apartheid relation that was inherited from the colonial project. And I think part of the key of that is to try and understand what was read in the 1940s already that prompted the apartheid project as the contradiction or the conundrum of the urban African, which was read very much in that time, and I think still we live with the legacy of that. The urban African is a contradiction in terms, right? And I think what we sit with now is the repercussions of the implementation of and the rejection of, in the implementation of a massive racist policy regime that tried to make the urban African impossible. And of course, with the end of apartheid, and even just before that, the end of the control of Africans coming into the city, the urban African is now the norm, right? I mean, we've had massive intensification of urbanization in the last 10 years on the continent as a whole. So the urban African is no longer an inconceivability. It is the reality. And yet it still feels like we live within an intellectual, conceptual, political framework that in which that category still reads as a problem. So for me, but I think it's the key to trying to think out how does one operationalize being African, being black in an urban context. How does one do that well? And so I think it's very exciting that right now, kind of new young political provocations are precisely trying to think about the question of land. Land has always been a key dimension of post-colonial debate, of nationalization, etc., kind of national consciousness. But right now, what we're sitting with in South Africa is a way in which the question of land is no longer considered a question of rural agricultural space. It is now fundamentally a question of urban challenge and an anti-racist politics of urban space. And so for me, what's so exciting is to think about how does one produce African urban space, how does one invest in anti-racist work that allows that to happen, how does one break the structure of the colonial town and township. And the city allows for a reading of that social relationality in a very intense and dramatic way that forces not only a confrontation with racism and equality, but also forces the reimagination of what it means to be African. It forces the reimagination of what it means to build and think from the black continent.
That's tremendous. Willie?
Yeah, let me just, I'm going to go way out on a limb here.
Now you're going to go out
Yeah.
because you've been sitting under the banyan tree for the last half hour.
Yeah, I mean,
Doing your thing.
I mean, I'm curious as to what, and sort of summarizing centuries of black, global black history. Yeah. I'm always puzzled, why is it that blackness is something that is so punished? Why is it something which is in some ways so dangerous? And I think what I'm trying to get at here in this slide is to say that, first of all, the city has ceased to exist. That in some ways, I buy into the Brenner Schmidt thing of that the city doesn't exist any longer. But that in some ways frees us in some way, not to have the city necessarily embody urbanization. So it's free from that, it's detached from that. What I think that blackness embodies in relationship to the city is at the heart of the city's promise. The city's promise as a kind of mode of existence in which we live not as we live. That is, you in the blue shirt and the beard and sitting there in your chair, and me in the hood with, and we're registered somewhere, right? We have birth records, we're citizens of somewhere, we're listed, we have a residence, we're countable, we're findable, we're addressable, we address others through our individuality. This is the composition of the city we think it is. What blackness embodies, and why blackness is so dangerous, is that it points to a way of existing in the city in which this is no longer operative, where the kinds of elements and things and identities which we are used to in some ways explaining each other by simply are not operable, simply don't exist. That there's a way in which there's a different modus operandi. And if you look at the experiments, the great experiments of black residency in Chicago, in Detroit, in the early part of the 20th century, where black, and we're not talking about communities now, we're not talking about sort of notions of community, but where the kind of black machine of occupation came closest to a form of living in the city that was not reliant upon these kinds of differentiations between human, non-human, individual identities. There was something else. And in some ways, to come down hard on that was in some sense the response. At the same time, your ability, you in the blue and the beard, to think of yourself, reflect upon yourself as a kind of individual resident of a city is in large extent also dependent upon blackness. Because to be in the city, the ability to think of ourselves as sort of individual consciousness reflecting upon our notion of citizenship, on our notions of rights, depended upon turning other human beings into a kind of labor, into a kind of substance that didn't have that kind of possibility. So you have this kind of doubleness. Our ability to occupy and to think ourselves in the city in terms of this kind of individuation, predicated on blackness, but blackness also giving us the sense, the glimmer of a kind of city that will do its job and efface these kinds of differences and allow for a kind of way of existence which we can't, it's difficult to wrap our minds around.
And I think the most powerful parallel would be very much the question of caste and tribe in India that follows blackness in exactly the same way. The premise of its presence, but not its legibility, not its articulation, and its erasure. And I think very much imagining, reading Mary Douglas's Purity and Danger about dirt as matter out of place. The need constantly for order to keep dirt in its place, to keep it, but to constantly erase it and reframe it again. And I think what two of you have given us just in these two responses is an astonishing way to also think about critical urban studies and theory, about two ways of imagining blackness, embodied not just on the black body, but also very much on histories of belonging that are spatially produced. And I think so much of our social theory that has talked about blackness and otherness and caste and identity has not taken seriously how powerfully spatially policed those productions have been, that the where of the question is as important as the how and the what of the question. And I think this is really some place where the city allows us to bring those two together, perhaps equally powerfully in Chicago as Jakarta and Johannesburg, and not in this North-South divide. And thank you both very much for that. Let me take more questions from the audience. Yeah, one on here, one on the corner. Up front, I have to give you this.
Thanks to both speakers, great comments. By way of clarification, and if I may very quickly, a question to both of you. To Malik, I think this was alluded to in one of the earlier comments. Your binary of slow and fast is not fully clear to me, and the lack of clarity comes from many similarities that I see in your examples, where there's a lot of generative stuff happening, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of relational improvisation, there's an absence of policy oversight. So I don't see them as being very different, if at all. And where I'm coming from is, logically speaking, the opposite of speed would be a sense of stillness of time, where nothing moves. Maybe a village in the middle of the city where things haven't changed forever. Or a reduction of scale, right? Instead of flyovers and bypasses and buildings, things get really miniature. That would be the logical opposite of speed, because in both your speed and slow examples, I see overlaps and cross-cutting themes that confuse me. So clarification on that would be appreciated. I mean, and just the final comment would be, even on a flyover, you have speed with a flyover, and then you have what I would say super speed, where subaltern gangs are riding motorcycles and breaking traffic laws and painting graffiti and causing further improvisation. So that's just a thought for you to think about, perhaps. Kelly, thanks for your comments. I'm just taking off from Gautam's comparative comment from earlier, and even in India, we've seen protests in many universities, occupying of university campuses. The big difference from the brief image I got from your images and what I've seen in India is that state violence has been terrific and it's been decisive in India, right? And something in your presentation leads me to believe that there were enabling conditions or a serendipity of time that allowed these urban protests to be as successful as they were in South Africa. And I'm curious about, is that indeed the case, or was it something distinctive in these methods of protest that made these protests so successful?
Okay, so my question is for Kelly, but it's quite similar to what Ape just said. So I was actually in Cape Town for the Roads Must Fall protests, and I was living in Langa, the township. So I went to Khayelitsha quite often, and so a lot of what you said really resonated with my experiences in Cape Town. And so I guess what I wanted to know, or what I wanted to understand a bit, was similar to the previous question in terms of sorry, I'm a very nervous public speaker. I guess I'm interested in understanding how did the formation of this protest really bring an interest to all races, all socioeconomic classes, and really sprang into like a nationwide protest, because it was just quite exciting for me to be in my minibus taxi talking to these guys, and everyone was talking about Rhodes Must Fall, and then going to my host family and talking to my host mom about it in Langa, and then my white UCT professor. It was all just very part of that movement, and I guess I'll stop there, because if I keep talking, I'll trail off.
Do you want to go first?
I can. Yeah, thanks. I think South Africa finds itself very recently it's only 20 odd years ago that the apartheid state fell and the initial phases of democratization occurred. So we're in this moment where there are people in government who have been student protesters in the anti-apartheid project, right? So they are seeing these students, some of which are their children, and absolutely recognizing the register of protest, absolutely recognizing the claim. This is completely familiar, and yet the object that is being addressed was supposed to be the Liberation Party, right? That liberated the country from precisely the problems that the students are critiquing. So there's a kind of proximity to transition that makes South Africa always a strange case, because apartheid sort of ended really at the tail end of the 80s when the Berlin Wall fell. So the coming of democratization occurred at the same moment as the sort of heavy arrival of neoliberalization. So you have this very ambivalent, very volatile national project, which is always, where there's always a competing agenda between the kind of rapid rollout of projects of profit and capital alongside the attempt to democratize. And so you get these ambivalent politics all the time. And I think what you saw in the last images is a case of a state and the university management that is aligned to the state being very quick to learn about new forms of securitization and being willing to implement them in ways that they weren't even last year. I mean, it's shocking to us to see this kind of securitization and militarization on campus. We did not believe this possible last year. Right? So I think that volatility is constantly at play, and we're also in response to that constantly trying to play the card of this is supposed to be a democracy, this is what happened under apartheid, this is right, as a way to remind the African National Congress that in fact they have an obligation to these kinds of claims. In terms of the speed at which it nationalizes, I think it has everything to do with the fact that there is widespread discontent with the way in which the transition out of apartheid has been managed. Widespread amongst the poor. And yet, this has I spoke about South Africa being protest capital of the world. And in fact, many people have named these protests popcorn protests because it pops up here and it pops up here and it pops up here and it pops up here. So there's this kind of mass of protest, but it doesn't go anywhere substantial in terms of a national movement or a national trajectory or a national party, right? And the question that many of us on the left have been asking for a long time is, what will be the thing that unifies this collective dissent and actually forges something that can substantively shift the national politics of the country in the direction that it was supposed to go in terms of liberation and post-freedom. So I think many people saw, my God, these are middle-class students that have access to tertiary education, or at least not, if they're not resolutely middle-class, that they will be able to become middle-class, right? Who are explicitly reneging on the class promises of university education in order to critique the transition. This is a huge deal, because it's young black aspirant students who are saying, fuck your national project, right? And I am going to commit a kind of suicide in relation to it because I recognize the limitations and I don't want to be a hand-picked black class aspirant that basically lubricates the continuation of an apartheid relation. So I think this was what was so shocking, is that these were young people who could actually have made it into the kind of existing class structure that hasn't really changed. But there was a refusal of that, and that was deeply shocking to me.
Yeah, I mean, of course, these are sort of oversimplifications of temporality, and of course, there's cross-cutting things all of the time. I guess what I'm just trying to illustrate that in some ways, the rush to build, while it takes into consideration a plurality of variables, it almost in some sense seeks to dismiss them because it understands that the alignment of those variables need not be what they are at the moment. So the rush to build tries to outpace the possibility of their alteration in terms of a constellation with each other. And of course, in large-scale development, cities across the world are littered with the stuckness and littered with the failures of these kinds of massive constructions. I mean, it's littered, the landscape is littered with them. What I'm talking about in terms of a kind of trap, a kind of a sense of a speed trap, of a slowing things down, is in a sense much more of a kind of wait and see attitude. I mean, you do something, then Gautam does something, then Smita does something, and then I'm sort of looking at what you're doing, and then I try to do something in response. I see how you react to it, then maybe you see what I do and react to it in a kind of incrementalism of varying intensities amongst a wide audience of people within a given space. And we respond to each other in a way that at times involves a kind of hesitation. I may have the capacity to add a fourth floor, a third floor to my house. I could do it. I mean, I have the money, I could do it, but I might hesitate only because I want to see what the reaction maybe of my surroundings is to that. And maybe they have a particular kind of response to it, which may lead me to change what I might want to use that third or fourth floor for. So in a sense, it's a kind of a give and take that slows things down somewhat. Of course, your examples are the case. There's cross-cutting things all the time. Sometimes you hear that, a neighborhood hears that you can get, a couple tons of rice for, this, and you have to act within the next hour or else the price will disappear, and people mobilize at great speed in order to collect the money, in order to buy at that kind of volume. So I don't mean to make rigid distinctions. I'm just trying to illustrate a kind of different rhythms at work within the sort of same environment, and raise the question of what, I don't have an answer to it, but raise the question of what do those kind of contrasting rhythms then produce over time.
Right, we are at time, speaking of it. Please, I'm going to ask you guys just a concluding question to close us off, just a very brief one, and it's very specific because I think it's important to ask it here. The word method was used by both of you multiply in a way that, when it comes from institutions of learning, very much in turmoil, wouldn't recognize. Speed is method, infrastructure is method, but contingent one. Occupation is method, circulation is method. And what strikes me is that these are very much methods of practice in everyday urban life, but they are not methods of analytics in the production of urban theory and urban knowledge. And somewhere, to me, this is where the distinction between the city and the campus reproduces itself, because there is a boundary to those notions of methods. So I'm imagining myself, in a new university trying to teach something called urban practice and saying, would I teach circulation as a method? of a new urban practitioner? Would I teach blurring as a method? Would I teach violence as a method? Would I teach? So how do we inside, in a different time scale? I mean, one notion of fast and slow is also the academy and life. And there is a definite, and there is a resistance, there is gating, there is, in terms of academic language, in terms of access, in terms of fees, in terms of physicality, in terms of our closed campuses. I mean, UCT literally, and if you've been on that campus, it's up there on the damn hill. Like, if you had to walk to it, it takes half your life. You know? And there's a real reason for that. And there's a reason why ivory tower universities were on hills, I mean, quite literally. So if you were to leave us with a sort of missive on what are the new ways of seeing and learning and being, what are the new methods outside our clunky textual analytics that we should be as adopting and experimenting with, as not just creating new theory from the South, but trying to create new institutions of learning that don't replicate actually just the apartheid relation, which is not a relation that's specific to South Africa, or the relation of blackness as other, which is not a relation specific to America. Very much places that an institution like this will have to face in itself, looking at itself in the mirror, in its twinning. So what would you, both also as teachers and educators, leave us with as these new ways of learning and knowing an object like the city that may not anymore even exist?
No, I mean, I like some of the experiments that have been done, where public schools stay open 24 hours a day and are occupied by different kinds of groups, different kinds of activities. So it's open 24 hours a day. And from 9 till 2, you have kids that are in the school having their lessons, but for the rest of the time, you have, you know, people being taught other different kinds of skills. You have opening up to the communities to do, and you have overlaps. And everyone is, and once these schools are open 24 hours, people have to negotiate when they have access to the classrooms under what auspices. And those negotiations are quite interesting. Who gets to be in a school? What gets to be the kind of function of a public school that stays open 24 hours a day? Who gets to be a teacher? Who gets to be a student? Who gets to be a provider? Who gets to be a constituent? And to negotiate those kinds of relationships in something called a school is, to me, a fairly interesting way to start to think about these kinds of interfaces.
God, I have so much to say about this. I don't know where to start. But
the first
I mean, at the moment, I'm seriously disillusioned with the project of the university. And I feel like it has a lot to do with what's going on at mine. And also having gone to a US university for a PhD, I'm severely disillusioned with that whole project. So northern universities by no means offer any kind of plausible solution to this. In fact, they've produced the most vile instantiations of institutions of learning that I've seen in a long time. Vast elitism, completely useless jargon, the most self-aggrandizing in the worst way forms of knowledge production, and profound barriers between the institution and the social context in which they exist. I mean, we need to call this out. Honestly, it's revolting. And yet they produce great books somehow. I think one of the reasons why they might produce good books still, although I think there's probably a limit to that, is that there is something about being afforded a space to think. I mean, what's this great piece by Derrida on the autonomy of the university?
particularly the humanities. There's something about having the freedom to experiment and some kind of space to be able to reflect and to pause, and that there are no rules in that space, right? That there is something about the autonomy of an institutional space that should be able to, but I mean, the complexity between the production of autonomy and the production of accountability, of social accountability, of some kind of obligation that the institution has to the social context in which it resides, that dilemma, I think, is something that we need to worry about anew all the time. We're having very, very intense conversations right now in South Africa about producing what we're framing as the decolonized public African university. So this is the kind of rubric under which we're beginning to think afresh about what the hell do we make of these old colonial forms and what we do in them. It's a really tough conversation, and half the time I want to leave. But method is critical. It's absolutely critical, and how one, in a context like Africa as well, when the kind of development industry has hit the continent in such a dramatic way, and states have disinvested from universities to such a degree that development organizations are determining the nature of intellectual labor and intellectual practice primarily through this kind of mistrustful investment in the technology of method. So you write these reports, half of which are about your fucking method, without any kind of curiosity about the intellectual project. So method is a really, really important thing for us to worry about in many ways.
Join me, please, in thanking both of them. Thank you for staying. Have a good evening. Come back. The public series is ongoing. And again, if you need to sign out, just find one of us so you can be clued into what's going on. Thank you all very, very much. It was so much fun.